In the summer of 2021, a new space race took off.
2, 1, 0.
Unlike a previous space race throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, however, this one was not widely received with a sense of enthusiasm and optimism.
Yeah, dumbest thing I ever heard, man.
Why don't these guys want to fix the Earth we already have?
Many saw them as displays of extravagance, particularly following a pandemic where numerous social inequalities and tensions were exacerbated all around the world. That same summer, the UN IPCC released its most comprehensive and up-to-date report on climate change, also its most severe.
We are on a fast track to climate disaster.
It should be noted, many of these space expeditions gave at least lip service to climate change as a motivator. Elon Musk has long talked about the terraformation of Mars as a goal, in anticipation of an uninhabitable Earth. Now to me, the thought of terraforming Mars, and so much of the language we use around it, carries strong notes of colonialism. When you think of art and storytelling and fiction, even a lot of the language we use in science fiction all revolves around wars and conquest and more colonial imagery. I know many of them are great critiques of such systems, but it made me wonder, are there any visions of space and of the future without those things? All these brought to mind the words of James Baldwin. Some wish to colonize the moon, while others dance before it like an ancient friend. I decided to draw from cultural traditions, art, and references in order to create a new imagination for the future, a decolonized vision of space. I like to call this project Filipinos in Space. So this here's the lead-off piece to my series, and it very directly has the quote I was referencing, and not to mention James Baldwin himself. Given that this series contains a theme of exploration, it kind of made sense to explore an artistic style pretty different from what I normally go with. Now the quote from James Baldwin, it comes from his essay No Name in the Streets, and he contrasted that desire to dance with the colonizers' desire to conquer the moon, to challenge this perception in America of Africa as a dark continent. I layered the ode to Baldwin with a couple of images of dance significant to Filipinos. You see here the tinikling, that one's from the Visayan region of the Philippines, and it's a pretty popular dance where people move their feet to a rhythm in order to avoid the snaps of large bamboo poles. The dance is supposed to mimic the way that a tickling railbird would dance, dodging the traps that rice farmers would set for them. And then from a much more contemporary standpoint, you see the breakdancer out front. Some of the earliest days in hip-hop, especially in LA and the Bay Area, you saw a lot of Filipino b-boys really establish their way throughout the scene. And these are like the foundational days of hip-hop. I was listening to a podcast interview with Brandy Miller where she was asked what she would say to people of faith with marginalized identities, and she talked about how indigenous people have always known God and reached out and found their ways to connect with the divine ages before colonization. Now, while Catholicism has made a clear and strong imprint on the Philippines, efforts to connect with the divine reverberate throughout pre-colonial Philippine mythology. In Kapampangan mythology, there's a creator god, Bathala, and he has a son and a daughter. Son is Apulaki, the sun god. Daughter is Mayari, goddess of the moon. The two of them are arguing over control of the earth when things get out of hand and they start attacking each other with bamboo clubs. It gets so wild, Mayari is hit in the eye and goes blind, which makes Apulaki actually feel really remorseful. They decide, we're going to share control of the earth, you get it during half of the day, I get it the other half, which is why you have sun and moon day and night. It's important to note that these stories weren't just for entertainment value, they had a real practical role. The depicted constellation we have here is a star formation called Balatik, which refers to a traditional pig trap, and that's kind of the shape it takes when drawn out. In certain areas, the arrival of these stars signaled the beginning of planting season. Little fun note, the script you see written underneath there is Babayin. It's an ancient writing script of the Philippines which has recently undergone a revival of interest. So here's a piece called Putjoro. It's focused on the future of the Philippines and the theme of sustainability. Big theme in the idea of space exploration, big theme in my life. The Philippines boasts so many diverse and impressive ecosystems, and yet so many environmental problems. It's the country with the highest number of environmentalists per capita murdered each year. And while the standard of living for Filipinos has steadily increased over the course of my lifetime, you have to wonder what further advancement looks like in the future as climate change takes its toll. It's only appropriate that a future-themed piece features a drawing of a child. National hero Jose Rizal once said that youth was the hope for the future, and so it just made sense to have a young person at the forefront of this drawing, and an indigenous Aeta young person at that. Any young person living in today's world is going to be confronted with the reality of the climate crisis unfolding over the course of their life. I often find sustainability tends to be a conversation dominated by white Western images, whether that's nations like the US holding the bulk of speaking time during intergovernmental negotiations, or just the branding of sustainable products clearly marketing towards a white suburban audience. I think as a result of those repeated stories, you kind of get this notion that the Western world will be the starting point for deploying things like electric vehicles or solar power and these solutions. In reality, it's the lower income countries that are seeing the fastest rates of population growth and the fastest rates of urbanization, meaning they're probably the spaces where we need to most rapidly invest in clean energy infrastructures. In this drawing, you can definitely see the solar panels coming out, as well as an electric jeepney, an ode to a modern imagination of the beloved vehicle. But I want to make something clear with this piece. Sustainability would not be a novel concept to the Philippines. Here you have some banana leaves. Now, it always impresses me how many uses for banana leaves Filipinos can find, from using it as the tablecloth spread for a Kamayan feast, to simply using it as your saran wrap alternative that breaks down in the best way possible. Also note the Skyflakes tin. Anyone with a Filipino Lola likely knows what's in there, and it's not crackers. That is your sewing kit. Hard to get more sustainable than just having the instinct to repurpose. You know, one characteristic of that 2021 space race was that it was a very individualistic endeavor, which is in total contrast to a traditional Filipino sense for community and sustainability. One of the most traditional ways you see this play out is in the style of housing, the bahay kubo. This is a style of house you see all throughout the Philippines, especially in fishing communities. The house is typically built on stilts, giving it versatility whenever waters change levels and things get higher, but it also allows you to just up and move your entire house. When it's time for that, the entire community gets together and literally puts a house on its back, carrying the structure by its stilts. I think the bahay kubo is an excellent physical manifestation of bayanihan, the concept of civic unity and cooperation among Filipinos. You know, even in times when Filipinos might be separated from one another, there's still an element of togetherness. One of the strongest ways you see that play out is how overseas foreign workers play such a major role in most Filipino households and in the Philippine economy overall. If you want to dig deeper, definitely watch the Manila episode of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown. Whenever individual members of Filipino families begin lives in Canada, the US, the United Arab Emirates to look for further resources, it's always with a thought for people living back home. We are travelers. Look, there's a lot of talk about how sustainability and travel can go together and how they conflict. When it comes to envisioning a decolonized vision of the future, so often colonization and conquest is wrapped up in travel. And so when it comes to finding a decolonized vision of the future, you wonder, what role does travel play? Does that go too? Filipinos have been travelers for as long as anyone has recorded history, right? I've been to nearly 50 countries around the world, and it's really a rare exception when I don't encounter another Filipino. There's this popular saying in Pacific Island cultures about how the ocean separates us, but at the same time it connects us. And one can look between the Philippines, but also places like Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, even India, and see some cultural elements bearing strong resemblances to each other. So much of this dates back before Spanish, Dutch, and other conquests, meaning that these cultural symbols were spread via trade and travel before that time. The shell is a fantastic symbol of that interconnectedness. The capiz, in particular, is not just a souvenir, it's a material used in mosaic art and in religious construction throughout the region. As art and religion spread throughout the Malay Islands, you can see some of the strongest indicators of how these things moved from one island to another. This has got to be one of my favorite pieces based on how it turned out, Ligayang Revolucion. A Filipino vision for the future would simply be incomplete without a space for joy. One thing about colonial conquest is that joy rarely plays a role in the process. You know, smiles are only earned through the completion of finished work, but a non-Western notion of history and future just simply isn't linear. When you can recognize the seasonality of time, it allows us to be more present and to find joy in the present, joy in the process, even though the completion has not yet arrived. Recognizing how time is just a seasonal thing allows you to experience more joy in the present instead of reserving it for a completeness that might not ever come. In that sense, it allows us to access joy and live more fully, even though the future is still being written. Now, anyone who encounters Filipino joy can't miss it, but they can misunderstand it. So often it gets mistaken for naivete or passivity or even the acceptance of one's circumstances, even though those are the product of injustice. However, joy in the face of injustice might just be one of the truest forms of resistance. This image is full of things that are frequent expressions of joy throughout Filipino culture. You've got karaoke for starters, it's hard to overlook that. Also, a little basketball action in the background. And note who's in the center of this. A lolo, an elder. I think of a lot of the hate and abuse going towards Asian American elders these days, and I think joy can be a weapon against that. Who's ready to see my closing piece? Hip-hop fans will probably get the reference almost immediately, right? This is a reference to Outkast's ATLiens, and there's a lot of meaning behind that. First of all, this project would just be appropriation if not for proper homage to the people groups who inspired a lot of this thought. You know, this expression was catalyzed by a James Baldwin quote, and it draws from a lot of the practices you see in Afrofuturism, from artistic representations of black futures released from current oppressions. I think of the writing of Octavia Butler, or the artistry of Janelle Monáe, the music of Kamasi Washington, as some expressions of Afrofuturism that have influenced a lot of my approach to artwork. And yeah, another one would be Outkast, particularly ATLiens. Now, ATLiens came out in the mid-90s at a time where hip-hop was pretty polarized as a East Coast-West Coast rivalry, and here two pretty eclectic rappers from Atlanta make a name for themselves by playing up their outsider status. That was a huge theme through the ATLiens album. A lot of the messages you see buried in this design all carry themes of solidarity. So on the ATLiens album cover, you see Andre 3000 and Big Boy basically in these exact same poses and outfits, standing back to back as a whole bunch of ominous forces are kind of surrounding them. I took a little bit of a different approach here. The figures around them aren't so much a threat, they're more behind them, as in, I got your back. Here you've got Ida B. Wells, a prominent voice in her day against the Filipino-American War. Right above her, you have an image of a Buffalo Soldier, one who's commonly identified or misidentified as David Fagan. These were black American soldiers who famously deflected in support of the Filipino opposition. On the upper left here, you see an Ayeta girl, a member of the Philippines' darker-skinned indigenous people group, and a reminder of why black and brown solidarity matters. And here you have Larry Itliong, whose work alongside Cesar Chavez often gets overshadowed, but his legacy is a bold reminder of that cross-diaspora solidarity with the Latine community. Finally, I tried to refrain from using a ton of text in this project, but there's one pretty front and center on this one, kapwa. Unpacking its definition is a little bit complicated, but it's basically the concept of how one's sense of self is found in the space shared with other people. It has implications for equality between people. This project was a fantastic chance to use visual art to do a deep dive into my Filipino heritage, some symbols, meanings, and stories that deserve a deeper look. It also wasn't just a look back, but a look forward as to what values, what traditions, and what stories can guide the future we're all shaping together. Thanks for watching, maraming salamat, and I'll see you later. Ingat kayo.